A local policy meant to protect a community ends up at the center of a national firestorm after two tragic murders.
It really is an unbelievable sequence of events.
It is. And welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are unpacking the intense, really high-stakes battle over sanctuary cities.
Right, and we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We are pulling from local news reports, legal press releases, historical backgrounders, and academic studies. And our mission today is to figure out how these laws actually work on the ground. We want to look at the fierce legal battles they trigger and the real human impacts.
Exactly. And, doing it without taking sides, just looking at the mechanics and the data.
Right. Because we have to start with the reality of what happened in Santa Clara County, California. Let's just look at the raw facts of the recent murders of 59-year-old Bambi Larson and a 24-year-old mother named Kembry Chirinos Flores.
Yeah, these cases are just devastating.
They really are. Both of these women were killed by undocumented immigrants. And the suspects did not just appear out of nowhere. Both men had prior arrest records. But here is the detail that set off a massive political explosion. Local police actually had these men in custody before the murders.
And they're right there in the local jails.
Right. But the jails released them. They let them go back out into the community without telling federal immigration authorities. And they did this because of a local sanctuary policy. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is aggressively using these cases. They are slamming local sanctuary policies and demanding an end to what they call absolute insanity.
I mean, DHS points out the extensive records these men had.
Exactly. I mean, Gerzon Jose Chirinos Mongria had 2 prior domestic battery arrests. And Franklin Inestrosa Martinez had been deported twice already, and he had an active warrant for a homicide in New Jersey.
Wow, a homicide warrant.
Yeah, but the local jails just let them walk out the front door. So before we can really understand why DHS and local governments are at war, we have to understand the actual mechanics. What even is a sanctuary city?
Right. And to get that, we have to look at the history, because the sanctuary movement isn't a new thing. It actually started way back in the 1980s.
Wait, really? The 80s? I thought this was a recent political thing.
Nope. It started with faith-based groups and churches, mostly in the American Southwest. They were publicly protecting Central American refugees from deportation.
Okay, so it started as a religious movement.
Exactly. These people were fleeing brutal civil wars, and the government wouldn't grant them asylum. So churches stepped in to offer a safe haven. And today, that grassroots movement has turned into hard civic policy. Over 560 cities, states, and counties consider themselves sanctuaries now.
Okay, so let's break down the actual gears of this, because we hear sanctuary city all the time, but, what is the actual legal mechanism happening inside a jail?
Well, it all comes down to 2 very different pieces of paper. You have a civil detainer request, and you have a judicial warrant.
Okay, what's the difference?
So ICE, the Federal Immigration Agency, they send civil requests to local jails. It's basically a memo asking the jail to hold an inmate past their normal release date, usually for an extra 48 hours.
Just to give ICE time to come get them.
Right. But sanctuary cities refuse these requests. And they refuse them because they aren't signed by a judge.
Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. It's like a local security guard refusing to hold someone for the FBI unless the FBI brings a permission slip actually signed by a judge.
That is a perfect analogy.
But wait, isn't it illegal for local cops to just straight up ignore federal agents?
Well, this is where the Fourth Amendment comes in. Local officials argue that holding someone in a cell without a judicial warrant directly violates the Fourth Amendment.
Because it protects against unreasonable search and seizure.
Exactly. You can't just lock someone up because a federal agency sent a fax. The local cities argue that doing that opens them up to massive legal liability. They could get sued for millions.
But wait, if ICE just needs a warrant, why don't they just go get one from a judge?
Because most immigration violations are civil offenses, not criminal ones, like overstaying a visa. Standard criminal judges don't sign warrants for civil violations.
Oh, wow. So they're operating in 2 totally different legal systems.
Right. And local officials are clear. They say if ICE brings a proper criminal warrant signed by a judge, they will gladly hand the person over.
Okay, so it's not a blanket refusal. It's a demand for a constitutional standard. That makes sense. But you might think a state either is or isn't a sanctuary, Like it's a simple on-off switch.
Oh, it's definitely not that simple. It is a messy patchwork.
Yeah, let's look at California as a microcosm for this, because you have state laws and then you have local towns just kind of going rogue.
Right, so California has Senate Bill 54, SB 54. It passed in 2017, making California a sanctuary state. The rule is that local agencies cannot cooperate with ICE on minor crimes.
Like a simple misdemeanor?
Right. But the state law does allow jails to notify ICE if an inmate has violent felony convictions.
But Santa Clara County doesn't follow that, right? They go above and beyond the state law.
Exactly. Santa Clara strictly prohibits notifying ICE about release dates at all, period, even for violent felons.
So the state says you can call, but the county says absolutely do not pick up the phone.
Yes, but then you look at towns right next door, like Mountain View and Gilroy, and it gets even crazier.
Right, because the sources show some local police departments were actually violating state sanctuary laws by cooperating too much with ICE.
Yeah, they were explicitly breaking SB 54. Their policy manuals told cops they could ask about citizenship during routine stops, which is totally illegal under the state law.
Okay, I have to stop you there. How does a local police department accidentally violate state law? Don't they have lawyers checking their rule books?
You would think so. But it turns out 90% of California law enforcement agencies outsource their policy manuals.
Wait, they outsource the police rulebook?
Yeah, to a private for-profit company called Lexipol.
I mean, a private corporation is writing the rules for armed police officers?
Yep. Small departments don't have the budget to constantly update their manuals when new laws pass, so they just pay Lexipol a subscription fee to do it.
But clearly the updates didn't happen.
Right. A study from the University of Oxford found that 40% of police agencies in California were relying on Lexipol manuals that were out of compliance with the new SB 54 laws.
40%.
Yeah. They were literally using outdated PDFs to make decisions about detaining people on the street.
That is just wild. I mean, an outdated corporate PDF is dictating justice. But okay, policy manuals and constitutional debates, they can feel pretty abstract. The actual arguments for and against these laws are rooted in life and death consequences.
They really are. The stakes couldn't be higher.
And I want to pause here for a second because we need to give a quick disclaimer to you listening right now. We are about to cover some highly charged political arguments from both the left and the right.
Very charged.
Yeah. And we want to explicitly state that we are not endorsing either viewpoint here. We are just impartially reporting the arguments exactly as they appear in the source material. So let's get into it. What is the main argument for sanctuary policies?
The core argument is all about community trust. Proponents say that if undocumented people fear deportation, they simply will not report crimes.
Right, they go underground.
Exactly. Imagine a victim of domestic violence or a witness to a robbery. If calling the cops means they might get deported, they stay silent. And advocates argue that silence makes the whole city less safe for everyone because violent criminals can just operate in the shadows.
And they have statistics to back this up, right?
They do. A study by the Center for American Progress showed that sanctuary counties actually have lower crime rates and higher median household incomes than non-sanctuary counties. Plus, statistically, immigrants are less likely to engage in violent crime than native-born citizens.
And advocates also point out that ICE isn't exactly lacking resources. Like, ICE has massive surveillance capabilities.
Locally.
The sources mention a company called Vigilant Solutions. They give ICE access to something like 5 billion records. License plates, private business data, local police databases. So the argument is ICE doesn't need local beat cops acting as federal agents. They have the tools.
Right, but then you look at the anti-sanctuary arguments and they point to the devastating human toll.
Yes. Critics argue that ignoring ICE detainers releases actual predators back into communities. And they point right back to the tragic murders we discussed at the start of the deep dive.
Right, Bambi Larson and Kemery Trinos Flores.
Exactly. Opponents argue that if the jails had just honored the ICE detainers for those suspects, those women might still be alive. You have men with prior domestic battery arrests, men with active homicide warrants.
Right.
And the stats on enforcement are just staggering. After SB 54 passed in California, ICE arrests at local jails plummeted by more than 41%.
41% is a massive drop.
It is. And for critics, that isn't a success story. That is a total breakdown of public safety and the rule of law. So because these tragedies are so polarizing, they immediately become ammunition at the highest levels of government.
Yeah, this quickly moved from local jails to the White House.
Exactly. This turns local city budgets into massive political battlegrounds. Let's talk about the federal funding aspect.
So during the Trump administration, they issued Executive Order 13768. The whole point of this order was to withhold critical federal funding from sanctuary jurisdictions.
We're talking about money for public safety and emergency grants, right?
It's
Yeah.
exactly millions of dollars. The administration basically said, if you don't cooperate with ICE, we're cutting off your federal money.
I mean, that sounds like a giant game of financial chicken.
Yeah.
Does the federal government actually have the power to starve a city of its own tax dollars just to force them to do federal work?
Well, a huge coalition of cities decided to sue to find out. San Francisco and Santa Clara County led the charge,
Right.
and they were representing roughly 10 million residents across multiple states. They sued the federal government for overreach.
And the courts actually sided with the cities.
They did.
Federal judges, like Judge William Orrick, ruled that the executive order was unconstitutional because it violates the separation of powers.
Yeah, it comes down to the 10th Amendment and something called the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Mm.
The federal government cannot force local police to act as federal ICE agents.
Which is such a fascinating political irony.
How so?
Well, historically, the 10th Amendment and states' rights have been used by conservative states to push back against federal rules like environmental laws or gun control. But here you have progressive sanctuary cities using that exact same constitutional tool to fight off a conservative administration.
That is a really interesting flip.
It really is. So, to summarize our deep dive today, we've unpacked a lot. We looked at the intense constitutional debate over Fourth Amendment rights and judicial warrants.
Right, the difference between a civil fax and a judge's signature.
We explored the really messy reality of local police relying on private companies like Lexipol to write their policy manuals, and how those manuals can be completely outdated.
40% out of compliance, just wild.
We covered the passionate arguments from both sides regarding public safety, community trust, and the absolutely tragic crimes that spark this national outrage. And we looked at the massive
A
lawsuits
single vote
over
in the
federal
U.S. Senate
funding.
can freeze
It's
the
a
most
debate that
powerful
really
government
touches
on earth.
every level of government.
But right now,
And that connects
a
directly
political
back to you
standoff
listening,
threatens
because
to
whether
blow
you
up
live
the
in a
rules
sanctuary city
forever.
or not,
Yeah, we are
this
watching the
debate
fundamental
impacts
machinery
you.
of
It dictates
American
how your local
lawmaking
police
just
spend their time. It
grinds
decides
to an
how your
absolute
tax
halt.
dollars and honestly, the
Absolutely.
physical
It's about
toll
how
on
your
the people
community
inside that
balances
building
the
is
rule of
about
law
to
with
become
keeping
very
people
real.
safe.
Exactly.
Right, so let's set the scene.
But we want to
It's
leave you
March
with one
2026.
final kind of provocative
Picture
thought
the
to mull
hallways of
over.
the United States Capitol
We talked
right now.
about how
Aides are
90%
literally
of
dragging
California law
military-style
enforcement
cots
agencies
into back
outsource their rule
offices.
books to
Oh,
a
yeah.
private
Staffers are
for-profit
stockpiling
company.
energy drinks by the
Lexipol.
case.
Right.
Exactly. We're
So
looking at a
if
scenario where
local law
senators might
enforcement is
actively
increasingly
refuse to drink
relying
water
on private
just so they don't have to leave the
for-profit
floor to
companies
use
to
the
write their
restroom.
Which is
policies,
wild, and
who
it's
is
all
actually
because the
deciding
Senate is
what
completely
justice looks like
deadlocked
in your
over
neighborhood?
the
Save It America
your
Act?
elected
Right, that big
officials?
election overhaul
Is it the
bill.
Yeah.
voters,
It's centered
or
around
is it just
measures
a
like
corporate
voter ID
boardroom?
requirements.
That is a question that really
Democrats
changes
are
how you
aggressively
look at the
blocking
whole
this
system.
legislation,
It really does.
and Republicans
A
desperately
local
want to
policy
pass it.
meant to
But
protect
they
the
lack the
community
60
ends up at
votes
the
required
center
to
of a
break the
national
stalemate.
firestorm.
Which
But
means
maybe the real
frustrations
question is
are
who
just
actually wrote
boiling
the
over.
policy to begin with.
Today,
Thanks
you
for
have
joining us.
28 Republicans